Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And what about those gaps in Jesus' timeline? There are 5 huge holes in Jesus' history that the church tried to cover up. Let's look at them now. You can probably recall the story of Jesus' birth. The Virgin Mary, Joseph, Bethlehem, wise men, shepherds, angels, and of course, the Star of Bethlehem. It's an amazing story, but there is one tiny problem. There is no historical evidence for any of it. It's like trying to read about World War II without reading about Pearl Harbor. You just can't get the full picture. This lack of evidence doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem. It's just that we have no way of knowing when he was born. Scholars place Jesus' birth sometime between 07 BC and 04 BC. The reason they don't agree on the exact date is because they don't agree on which person or people the Gospel writers were referring to when they wrote King Herod the Great. There were 2 kings with that name. One was the son of Antipater the Idumean, who reigned from 20 BC to 04 BC. He was the classic evil king of the Nativity story. The other was the son of King Amatheus, who reigned from 73 to 63 BC. If the Nativity story is true, then the Gospels would have been written during the reign of the second King Herod. But if the Gospels were written during the reign of the first King Herod, then the story would be completely ahistorical. So when was Jesus born? No one knows. The church tried to cover this hole by creating the theory of the pre-birth. They claimed that Jesus was born before Adam and Eve, but obviously that makes no sense. Now let's take a look at Jesus' childhood. He spent his early years in Nazareth. His father, Joseph, was a carpenter, so presumably Jesus was a carpenter too. Or maybe he helped out in the shop after school. When he was 12 years old, his parents went up to Jerusalem for Passover, and Jesus stayed behind because he wanted to learn more about the law. This story comes from Luke chapter 2 verses 41 to 52. But let me ask you a question. Why did Jesus stay behind? Because he wanted to learn more about the law. Do you think that a 12-year-old kid would be interested in learning more about the law? Well, maybe. But there's another explanation. Maybe his parents didn't know that he stayed behind until they reached Jerusalem. Maybe Jesus walked out on his parents. That sounds pretty believable. Kids do that kind of thing all the time. But unfortunately, we don't have enough evidence to come to any solid conclusions. When Jesus was a teenager, he disappeared from the historical record again. We know nothing about his teenage years. There are 4 gaps in Jesus' timeline that are generally referred to as the hidden years. We don't know why these gaps exist, but there are a few possibilities. The Gospels may not have been written until much later than we think, or they could have been written during the reign of King Herod II, or perhaps some parts of Jesus' life were simply lost to history. As far as filling in the blanks goes, we only have theories. One such theory comes from Robert M. Price, a biblical scholar who believed that the missing years contained a secret gospel. Price thought that the original secret gospel was written by one of Jesus' disciples, and that it told the true story of Jesus' life. But over time, the church edited the secret gospel and removed all references to the miracles and teachings that appeared in the original. The church did this to make Jesus appear more divine and less human. Now this is just a theory. There is no evidence that a secret gospel existed or that the church covered up Jesus' life. There's also a theory that Jesus didn't disappear at all. In fact, some scholars believe that Jesus was the leader of a Jewish sect known as the Nazarenes. This group supposedly lived in a secret community in the desert. They kept themselves isolated from society, and their practices were never recorded by outsiders. Many scholars dismiss this idea, however, because there's no archaeological evidence that the Nazarene sect ever existed. We have no records of Jesus' adult life either. That's right. From the age of 12 to the age of 30, we know nothing about him. He didn't travel, he didn't write anything, and he made no public appearances. At the age of 30, he began his ministry. He traveled around preaching and performing miracles. After 3 years, he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. 3 days after he died, he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. The end, or is it? I mentioned earlier that Jesus performed miracles. These stories are found throughout the 4 Gospels. For example, he turned water into wine at a wedding feast. He calmed a storm on the Sea of Galilee. He healed a blind man, raised a dead girl back to life, and of course, he fed 5,000 people with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. But are these stories true? Well, there's no way of knowing for sure. The only accounts of Jesus' miracles come from the Gospels, and they were written by people who believed that Jesus was the Son of God. But keep in mind that they weren't writing history books. They were writing theology books. Their purpose was to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah. So naturally, they would include stories that portrayed him in a positive light. What about the non-miraculous things that Jesus said? Was he really the Son of God? Did he really live a sinless life? Was he really perfect? Again, we can't know for sure. But the fact that we have no independent historical sources makes it hard to believe. Most historians agree that many of Jesus' teachings are found in the sayings of Jesus, which was probably written between 50 and 70 AD, but that leaves a huge gap between Jesus' death and the writing of the sayings. Someone could have easily added false sayings to make Jesus look like a great teacher. Also, if Jesus really was the Son of God, why didn't he leave behind any documents himself? That's kind of weird. The historical Jesus may have been a good preacher and a great teacher, but there's no way of knowing what he actually said. Even the idea that he was born in Bethlehem is just a theory. But what about the resurrection? Was Jesus really raised from the dead? According to the Gospels, yes. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all claim that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. But once again, these are theological books, not history books. In fact, the only people who claim to have seen Jesus' body after he rose from the dead are Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James. But who knows how reliable those accounts are? Paul, who was responsible for spreading Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, didn't even think it was important to mention the resurrection. He said that if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. So I guess he thought that his followers needed to hear about the resurrection. But in his letter to the Corinthians, he never once described what happened after Jesus rose from the dead. Finally, we come to the ascension. According to Luke chapter 24 verse 51, as Jesus was speaking to his disciples, he was taken up in a cloud and a big jet stream and whisked away to heaven. Acts chapter 1 verse 9 says that the disciples watched Jesus ascend into heaven. But do we have any other accounts of the ascension? Actually, we do. There's a book called The Ascension of Isaiah, and it tells the story of Jesus going up into heaven. But it wasn't written until the 6th century AD, well after the Gospels. And that means that it wouldn't have been written by someone who saw the ascension firsthand. It was almost certainly written by someone who heard the story secondhand. So was Jesus really raised from the dead? And was he really taken up into heaven? We just don't have any way of knowing. In conclusion, the church did its best to cover up the holes in Jesus' timeline by creating miracles and editing ancient manuscripts. But the truth is that we know very little about his life. He left behind no documents and no physical artifacts. And that's a problem if you want to study history. Now, that's not to say that Jesus didn't exist. We have plenty of evidence to prove that he was a real person who lived in first century Palestine. But the historical Jesus was likely very different from the Jesus we know and love today. The Jesus of history was a Jewish preacher who taught people about the kingdom of God. The Jesus of faith is the Son of God who died on the cross to save humanity. Thanks for watching.